Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, 10 years ago, the term road home described the route from work to where we lived. A few months later, the term would be critical to our recovery. We'll look back tonight at the performance of the massive spending project, and some of the conclusions may not be what you expected. We'll also take a look at the cause and implication of falling oil prices, a new debate about gun regulation triggered by the Lafayette tragedy, the mayor and monuments, a plan to narrow a neutral ground, plus pondering the future of two buildings, the former Holy Cross High School and the old Carrollton Courthouse. On the road with us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. David Hammer, reporter at WWL-TV Channel 4. Kathy Finn, freelance journalist. And Jaquetta White, reporter, The New Orleans Advocate. First to Kathy. Good to see you again.
Hi.
Oil prices, they are falling. They've fallen a lot just since the beginning of the year. What's going on?
Kind of amazing. Well, it's a supply and demand, the old story, and we've got a glut of oil across the globe right now, and we have uncooperative production partners, you might say. OPEC, the OPEC cartel, which ordinarily under many conditions like this might be expected to cut back on production just to support the price, is not doing that now and is declined and pretty much has dug in and said they are not going to do that. Mm-hmm. Part of this stems from the fact that the U.S. has become such a major producer in the world now, is caught up with many of the Middle Eastern countries as far as the volume that they produce in the United States now. So if Saudi Arabia, for instance, were to signal that they're going to cut production and support the oil prices, they're really doing that. The biggest beneficiary would probably be the U.S. under those circumstances. And it's a political standoff now, largely. So they're not willing to do that. At the same time, we're seeing demand decline, primarily because of a slower growth in China. China is the big user, the big consumer of fuel across the globe right now, and has been for some time. And there's been a slowdown. You know, they're down to maybe a 7% growth factor, which sounds ridiculous in the United States where we're struggling to get to even 3%. Mm-hmm. But China has just been so powerful for so long economically. So a slowdown there is really felt. So at the same time you have too much production, you have slower demand. That's what's happening with oil prices.
So ultimately, what does it mean to us here in Louisiana in terms, first, of economic development for the state?
Well, in economic development, what you're seeing right now, we have, of course, a major industrial boom that's going on, or kind of an incipient boom, across South Louisiana with the industrial sector, with lots of plants that are big consumers. It's been driven largely by cheap natural gas, which is readily available in Louisiana. But some of the major projects that have been announced across South Louisiana over the past several years, really gigantic ones, are dependent on a big differential in price between oil and gas. And what's happening now, we still have cheap natural gas, but as the price of oil comes down and that differential shrinks, those projects could be in danger, and some of them have already pulled back. Mm-hmm. They haven't necessarily canceled them, but they've put them off for a while to see if the price comes back up a little bit.
I find it strange that just as all of these factors are coming into play, you see moves to expand into the Eastern Gulf, oil drilling and gas drilling, the Eastern Seaboard, and Alaska, in the Arctic. And it just seems to be contradictory with what's going on, almost like it's left over from a time when we were concerned about hitting peak oil and we were going to be, not have as much oil and it wasn't going to be available. And the shale, boom kind of happened and caught people by surprise, and it seems like we're still operating on this old model and we still can't export, and it just seems like we've ended up with this glut, and yet we're still trying to expand to new places.
I think part of that is there's been a shift to Alaska because it's easier and cheaper to drill there, and there's it's abundant and it's easier than it's cheaper than drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, for instance. So a lot of that is shifting over to Alaska. It is interesting though, on July 1, Shell announced a major project in the Gulf of Mexico, which I was surprised to see. They call it Appomattox. They like those dramatic names for their platforms. And it's going to be the largest floating platform that Shell has in the Gulf of Mexico. And they announced this at the same time that prices are just, basically tanking. And so it's hard to put that together. And then just this week, Shell announced layoffs like 6,000 layoffs, across the globe, and cut back in spending elsewhere. So who knows for sure? One thing that's happening is those projects, when they announce them, they're banking on the price of oil out 6-8 years.
Right.
That project would be completed somewhere around 2020. And so who knows what, they have their own projections about what the price of oil will be at that point, and it'll be that long before they start bringing in product.
Right.
Are we also seeing vehicles being manufactured to be more fuel efficient? Like, whereas in the past you might buy an 8-cylinder car, now it's 4 cylinders.
Well, yes, you were seeing that, but then funny how as soon as the gasoline prices started to drop, you saw people going back to the SUVs and the big pickups and all of that. So you're going, do they really care? I don't know.
Let me ask you real quick, too, the support industry, the oil support industry, the service industries here,
Yes.
and with this drop in oil prices, have we seen layoffs in the service industry?
There have been definitely cutbacks because it's a slowdown. There's activity in the Gulf of Mexico is slowing down, and so a lot of that offshore support activity has slowed down as well. But watch the state budget. Interesting, the revenue estimating conference pegged the price of oil at around almost $62 a barrel, and as of today, it's somewhere around 52 Louisiana crude. So that's a $10 differential right there for the current fiscal year.
Is it anticipated that it will go up, though, or do you think
they do? But there are some analysts right now who are saying it could go into the 30s before the end of the year. Now
Ready
you're going
for
to see
another deficit next year.
right, so you'll see it.
So a mid-year
They will
deficit.
be reevaluating as the year
Yeah.
goes on, for sure.
Okay, Kathy, thanks a lot. Another discussion that's just going on in town is about our monuments, some specific monuments that have Confederate ties, like the Robert E. Lee Monument at Lee Circle. And there were a couple of meetings held this week that you covered with sort of public meetings, but not entirely, to
right.
discuss this.
The mayor, through his Welcome Table initiative, invited about 650 people to 2 days of meetings, Wednesday and Thursday, at the Hyatt Hotel. About 115 people attended. And they were broken into small groups where they discussed in very general terms how they felt about the monuments. And these are the 4 Confederate and post-Civil War monuments around the city that the mayor has asked the city council to pass an ordinance declaring nuisances and eventually remove. And so the folks sat in these circles in the welcome table and they answered questions like, would you like to see the monuments come down? Would you prefer they stayed up? If they did come down, what should happen to them and what should go in their place? They didn't offer any formal recommendation, but it was mostly a feel good, get your feelings out kind of discussion.
So but these people were actually invited. They're part of a select group of people of, 650 that
Right.
are part of an even larger initiative. Is that right?
It's right.
The Welcome Table, is that the name of it?
That's right. So the 650 who were selected, it was the entire Tricentennial Commission of about 300 people, various neighborhood association presidents, about 200 or so, about 50 faith leaders, people on the advisory council for the New Orleans Police Department, and also NORDC. And so those were the select group, about 115 spanning that group attended. But the Welcome Table is a separate initiative that the city began last year in partnership with the University of Mississippi, a racial reconciliation program there.
But from the reporting I've seen, it doesn't seem like there was any clear direction that came out of the meetings.
No, and I don't think that was the purpose of it. It was mostly to listen and to share, to have people engage with each other, to find out what their neighbors thought about think about the monuments and what should happen to them. But again, there's no recommendation being made. Public hearings will happen probably in September, and that's where there may be some unveiling of a formal plan. At this point, we just know that the mayor thinks that they should come down, but there's nothing beyond that that's been discussed publicly.
Is there any public support at all for that Freedom Monument or whatever it's called, the one
Liberty
down,
Monument.
the
Liberty
Liberty
Place.
Monument, right? The one that was when the uprising, I guess, against the Reconstructionist government that had to be
Right.
put down. What support is there for that?
I don't think there's any. That's the White League Monument to a group of white supremacists,
White
basically.
Citizens League, yeah.
And most of the support is around the Lee Circle Monument, the Lee statue. There's a group called Save Our Circle that has a change.org petition that's generated about 22,000 signatures. And there's also a rally tomorrow to keep Lee Circle in place, but most
It's
of the support
interesting.
surrounds it.
The only one who's really from here is Beauregard.
That's right.
And it just seems like why people rally behind Lee. I mean, he was from Virginia, and there was no fighting in Louisiana in the Civil
Right.
War. So and it was when I was reporting in Arkansas, they used to do every year on Martin Luther King's birthday is also Lee's birthday, and they would do an editorial extolling Robert E. Lee in the paper. And I didn't never understood that strong connection with him. I guess because he was the leader of the.
You know, the thing about the Liberty Place monument, like the original battle wasn't as much black and white, it was control. It was about carpetbag control versus local control. And if they would have just left the original monument alone, but then a few years later, people came and added stuff about white supremacy, and that's where the problem came in. And then the monument has since been moved. It's already been, been moved. That was the first time we saw the term nuisance applied to a monument, because they applied that and it was moved back there. And so it was what was done to it in further years, and I think in the 1960s, the city added something to kind of like counter what other people had done, in saying something like, we recognize all the people who died in wars and that sort of thing. But it's going back and forth after the fact more than anything else.
Well, we should say, though, that there will be chance for more public comment, right?
Definitely.
There will be other meetings, and these are going to be open to the public,
Open
not
to the
by
public,
invitation.
anyone who wants to comment
And
will
this
be welcome
discussion
there.
is going to be going on in the next several weeks.
It'll be going.
in the city.
That'll start probably in September. That meeting will be called, and I imagine this discussion to continue through the end of the
And
year.
there are definitely 2 points of view on this.
There definitely are. It seemed that public support was in favor of the monuments coming down, but there's been a lot of opposition and also just indifference, and people saying there's so many other problems in the city.
Yeah.
Why are we focusing on this right now? So there are tons of voices around this, and they'll all come out in a few weeks.
Yeah, there's issues of cost, and then where would they go if they were removed. So we'll be talking about this more. Thanks a lot, Jaquetta.
Sure.
The road home, it really did get a lot of people home. This is what you're finding in your reporting about that project.
Yeah, I think it's something along the lines of not being able to see the forest for the trees when you're wrapped up in it, and having covered this program when it was just getting started and when it was at its height, and then all of the problems that surfaced afterwards. All of my reporting for years and years was really focused on the problems and the things that they missed and the changes that they had to make, and the way that people felt like they were treated like criminals because they had to be fingerprinted, and all of the steps of verification, and how slow it was in terms of payouts. But then when you get a little perspective and compare it to the program in New Jersey after Sandy, you see just how fast it was, paying 117,000 homeowners $7 billion in 2 years. And New Jersey was only able to accomplish 5% of that, both in terms of money and numbers, in the same 2-year period after Sandy. And that's just one point of comparison. The other thing is just the flat large number of homes that have been rebuilt. The fact that you have less than 7,000 of these 130,000 that have not been rebuilt at this point and are not in compliance. So that is, when you really take the full scope of it, it was eye-opening even for me, because I wanted to step back and say, I need to find people who have positive stories to tell, because I've been telling so many negative stories over the years.
But one thing you did point out in this, your most recent report, which you can find on the WWL website if you haven't seen it, is that without this program, this is what you have different folks talking about, without this program, our recovery wouldn't have happened as quickly.
Correct. And you can argue with the way they set it up. Should they have done something with rental properties first and then had that in place so people could get lower rents while they were actually rebuilding? Should they have done something more quickly with elevations? I think you can certainly say that they should have, because then they ended up having to do elevations after rebuilding, which caused all kinds of additional problems. And so a lot of these offshoot programs were a problem. But you clearly see that pockets of the city where they did not have the financial wherewithal of others were able to rebuild on the strength of the road home grants.
Now, there were hiccups and bumps along the road, that's for sure. And one of the big ones seems to be when it was first brought on board, Governor Blanco wanted to have staged payouts, but that changed.
Right, but in New Jersey they had staged payouts, and they seem to have had a lot of problems, even with the same exact contractors that Louisiana had running the program. The stage payouts was supposed to be to fight fraud and to make sure that people actually use the money for rebuilding. And there has been a lot of concern about getting money for elevation and using it for other things, potentially for rebuilding, but not enough to actually elevate, but in a lot of cases just using it on other things. But when you look at it in terms of the percentages, less than 7,000 out of 130,000 is a pretty darn good percentage.
How much money is involved with these 7,000, would you say? And is the state going after it to get money back from people who didn't do the work?
They are, but it's a mix, because you have some people that they've been able to find and are trying to work with, which they say is in the several hundreds. They didn't have an exact number, but you're talking about somewhere less than 1,000 who are actively trying to get over that hump where they just need a little bit more. And they're working in these, because there's 119 million still left in the pot that they can draw from to try to get over that hump. But you have others who've just basically absconded, and because they were allowed to sell their properties after getting the Road Home grant with the promise that whoever buys it would eventually rebuild, it's very, very difficult to enforce. So they're still trying to find thousands of people. There's essentially 20,000 plus that are not in compliance in some regard or haven't responded, but they know that all but 7,000 have actually rebuilt and reoccupied.
I guess the lesson for the learning too is save your receipts and your paperwork.
Right, because people are coming in on the back end and you have some money available, but HUD is being a real stickler for providing receipts to be able to qualify for additional funds.
And now we think of this most commonly in terms of people who rebuilt their houses, but I know in the case of a relative, for example, that you're seeing a second generation where people in effect sold their house to the Road Home program, and I've passed by that place, and now that the house was demolished, and now there's a new house at that site, and so you're seeing new locations and new buildings, and so the cycle continued.
Which was the idea behind the buyout process, and that's a very small number. It's only about 10 or 11,000 who got Road Home money specifically for the buyout. But what they're trying to do now is actually convert some of those people who are never going to be able to get the rebuild complete and get them to transfer their grant to a option 2, as they call it, where it's then turned over to the state for redistribution, basically.
Okay, David, thanks a lot. It was a very good report, very interesting. Thanks. Errol, there's talk to narrow Napoleon Avenue neutral ground, which is the median, in case you're unaware of what a neutral ground is, with all the new folks are in town. But a lot of people don't like this idea.
And technically, the term neutral ground applied to Canal Street. That was when it was first used. That was a neutral ground. Of course, it's been adapted to everything. Okay, and so the Napoleon neutral ground. This is part of that flood project that they have. And as part of the flood project, the city has given them a mandate. Hey, let's also include some bike lanes. We've talked about bike lanes. I mean, bike lanes are becoming a major issue in itself. The Napoleon neutral ground is 47 feet wide, and the Corps is coming up with a plan to cut it down to 38 feet. So you lose 9 feet to put a bike lane. And not many people like this idea, and because obviously we're cutting down, and then they'd say we put more trees up there, we put up a walkway, would make it really look nice, and people still don't like it. And the example you hear most often is because of Mardi Gras, that Napoleon is very popular, especially at the beginning of the parade. It's where people go early to parade, and it's especially that second weekend of Carnival, there's a lot of parades out there. But to me, it's more than that, because it is just a wonderful urban space to have that. I mean, even if you don't like going to parades, I mean, year-round, just to have that kind of space. And I think that the role that the neutral grounds have played in New Orleans in terms of are unappreciated, and especially during Mardi Gras. Think about the times when there's been so much tension in the city, but yet on given nights we've had 1 million people out standing on the neutral grounds. You know, the fact that we have that kind of space out there, few cities, nonetheless not having parades, don't have that kind of space as community gathering spaces. And so to me, you got to think of it in those terms too.
And there aren't that many that are that wide where you have that much green space amid all of the concrete around it. So.
Yeah.
And other residents are worried about traffic even going faster if the traffic lanes are widened.
And so the proposal, which is supposedly a combination of some of the neighborhood groups and some of the bike riding groups, say don't do that. but just take away a lane for Napoleon and make it a bicycle riding lane. People prefer to do that. You see a little bit of that in other parts of the city right now. It's a bit annoying, but you know, when you drive uptown, there's a trade-out that you make. You can't be in a hurry. Okay, if you want to be in a hurry, then tear down the St. Charles Neutral Ground and build a freeway. Okay, if you do that, okay. But if you don't want that, okay, you got to just realize it's going to be slow, but look at the oak trees, and look at the streetcars, and look at things along the way. And so that might be the trade-out that, you know, along Napoleon you have one lane for traffic and one lane for bikes.
But the decision has not been made yet, right?
Decision
And
has
the
not
Corps
been-
says it's really
been
the
made.
city's decision to make, right?
What?
The Corps says it's the city's decision
I think
to
the
make.
momentum is growing. I don't think there's much support for this plan.
Okay.
So I would be surprised if that's ultimately what's enacted.
Also, it's where residents would go to park if the water was going to rise, if there was
Yeah.
flooding. It's where you park in the neutral ground. Folks who live around there. And okay, Errol, thanks a lot. Gun regulation, that's an issue that people are talking about a little bit more again since that terrible incident in Lafayette, Louisiana last week. You were there for that.
Yes, well, I wasn't there for the shooting.
But you covered it.
Yeah, I
you
covered
went
it.
there,
I went for
covered it.
Reuters the following day. Yes, this is kind of the secondary story that came out of that terrible shooting and all of the tragedy in Lafayette, Louisiana last Friday. The follow-up story was and it came up that day on the Friday. The shooting was Thursday night. On that Friday, during press conferences, and of course they have a tremendous amount of national media there as well, and Bobby Jindal was out there, naturally for the press conferences, and you heard about, this is a tragedy on all of this stuff, and we heard one lone state legislator that I heard anyway at several press conferences, Representative Terry Landry from New Iberia came out and he said, it's time for us to have a conversation about the lack of gun restrictions in Louisiana and in our communities. And it was just kind of a throwaway. I mean, he didn't get much attention because there was so much else going on. But when someone finally started to press Bobby Jindal about it, isn't this a time to look at gun control? He really circumvented. He said, this is not the time to talk about gun control, which begs the question.
He referred to it as politics.
What is? He did.
He sort of referred to talking about gun control, that's politics.
Right. And you kind
That
of
was not the time to talk politics.
Okay, it's the day after a terrible shooting. Yeah. So he kind of blew it off at that point, but it was a question that kept coming back, and I heard it more than once from Representative Landry. And then gradually, as it came out that, they began to find out where this gunman bought his gun and so forth, and he bought it in Georgia, and he came from Georgia. Bobby Jindal made the statement that, well, he couldn't have bought that gun in Louisiana because at the time the story was that he had been involuntarily committed because the gunman because of a run-in in Georgia, and that a judge there had committed him involuntarily to a mental institution for some length of time. Well, so Bobby Jindal said, well, if that had been the case, he would not have been able to buy the gun in Louisiana.
But that wasn't the case.
That wasn't the case. As it turned out a few days later, the press learned that the judge did not, in fact, involuntarily commit him to a mental institution. She had never signed the order.
So he had the right to buy the gun.
He had a right.
Legally,
there was nothing to stop him from buying the gun.
Which would have been the case in Louisiana too.
Would have been the case here too.
He went.
Okay.
He was committed, right? Or he went to the mental institution, but it was not under this involuntary commitment.
The judge never
signing.
signed an order to do it,
and therefore it never existed in terms of what's recorded.
The trigger,
right.
so to speak, that would have triggered, a stop.
But
kept
back
him
to
from
just
buying
the
it.
discussion now about gun control. Are we seeing that bubble up again?
Well, I think you are seeing it bubble up, and I think it's something that you probably will be hearing, among other things, in the gubernatorial election in Louisiana, because this is now, it's hit so close to home, and it's a hot issue. It has to increasingly rise in the presidential election, too, I would think. It just depends, how many more of these are we going to have before the election comes around.
None,
Yeah,
but all right, Kathy, thanks. I'm going to go over to Jaquetta now and talk quickly about two different structures that have been in the New Orleans landscape for a very long time that are undergoing change.
And they both happen to be schools,
Yes.
former schools. I'll start with the Carrollton Courthouse. It's a 160-year-old Greek Revival style building built by the renowned Irish architect Henry Howard. And it was built to serve as the seat of Jefferson Parish before Carrollton was annexed by New Orleans. But most people know it as a school. It was McDonough 32 and Usher and, of course, Ben Franklin.
Yeah.
And so there's a push now. It's been declared surplus by the Orleans Parish School Board. It's fallen into disrepair. It's had some roof damage since Hurricane Isaac and been vacant since 2013.
And so the preservation is so worried if it's auctioned, it could perhaps be demolished.
That's right, that there would be no control over what happens to it next and it could be demolished. The school board has agreed to hold off on scheduling a date for the auction, and they're giving the community and nonprofits and a governmental agency perhaps the opportunity to step up and do something with it.
And this is the building that's in the Riverbend, right? Carrollton and St. Charles Avenue.
That's right.
Which you attended, you're saying, as
25 years ago, I went to high school there,
Yeah.
and it was in bad shape then.
Yeah, well, so the discussion is starting on that. And then there's Holy Cross, the old Holy Cross High School in the 9th Ward.
That's right, and most of the buildings on that site were razed after Katrina. The school moved to Gentilly on Paris Avenue, but there's one building that remains. It's the old administration building, a 4-story, 67-foot building, and it's being converted into offices and retail space by Perez Architects, and they're eventually going to build 2 other buildings alongside it as residential.
And the work has started on that site now?
The construction will begin in the first quarter of next year, but they're starting to meet with tradesmen and contractors, and they'll start issuing bids sometime in a couple weeks.
Some changes coming.
Very much so.
Okay, Jaquetta, thank you. Right, folks, time to look ahead.
Well, today the city reopened the new Stalling Center out in Bywater. The other time that kids used to go there before the area was known as Bywater. I mean, it was a popular landmark under disrepair, and so with the help of the city and with FEMA, opened the calling it a state-of-the-art center with a pool.
Okay, thanks. David.
Well, this week, with a month to go before the 10th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, WWL-TV started our Katrina webpage where you can go and see all of our articles about the anniversary, but also various members of our staff are doing videos talking about what we experienced, what we went through, and it's a really nice way to reminisce.
Indelible memories, I'm sure.
Right.
Thanks, David. Kathy.
Also on Katrina, tomorrow is August 1st, and so we've got a month-long commemoration that's probably going to begin tomorrow. Some of that will begin this weekend. Contemporary Arts Center has some exhibits that are beginning today, actually, I think, and we're going to see a lot more of that coming later on. You remember right after Katrina when Wendell Pierce put on the Waiting for Godot in eastern New Orleans? I mean, that kind of sparked a lot of dramatic productions that are still going on out there.
It certainly did. Thanks a lot, Kathy. Jaquetta.
And on a lighter note, also this weekend, it's an opportunity to celebrate the city's native son, Louis Armstrong. The annual Satchmo Fest is this weekend. It's always a sleeper festival because it's so late in the summer, but also a good time.
It certainly is always a good time. Definitely. Thanks, Jaquetta. And I also want to say our sincere condolences to the family of Dr. Norman McSwain and to all of his colleagues. Dr. McSwain was a real pioneer in emergency medicine. He was a wonderful guy, and his loss will really, really be felt. And thank you for everything that you did, Dr. McSwain. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week.